Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. If you haven't met me before, my name is Saul and I'm an adult child and adolescent psychiatrist, and my channel is all about psychology and behavior and how can we do a better job understanding our own behavior. And in particular, I'm interested in trying to use psychology to help people and to understand what's going on with behavior and also what's going on in the bigger world and how behavior can lead to problems and harm and what kinds of solutions we can come up with. So, speaking of that, today's presentation is all about social harm and where does it come from. And so, let me just say a few words about what I'm talking about and what I want to talk about today. Social harm is just a general term that I'm using to describe a whole bunch of things that I think have a couple of, well, more than a couple of ideas in common. And I'm talking here about all of the isms: racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, classism, economicsism, if that's a word. All of the sources of social harm that we are all too familiar with in our everyday lives. And where does all of this come from? I was inspired to make this video when I was doing a whole bunch of research, primarily on racism. And what I found was that nobody out there, as far as I could tell in the published literature, really had a good explanation for where it comes from. We can certainly see that it happens. That's very clear. There's no doubt that racism is going on, and we can see it in data as diverse as healthcare outcomes and economic disparities and educational disparities. And, I think if you just look at the rates, for example, of how often people are approved for loans, say on a house, to buy a house or to buy a car, you can easily find data that indicate that there is racism in the system. And but the problem is that I really couldn't find any good models for explaining where it's coming from and what can we do about it and how do we actually figure out what's going on, like boots on the ground, what's actually happening, and like really super important, like what do we do about it? So this is what I call an explanatory model, and I really couldn't find anyone who had any very clear explanatory models, and I certainly couldn't find any consistency from author to author. Individual authors will have ideas, and those ideas are clearly explained. But I don't see a whole lot of consistency in the profession from one author to another. And more importantly, I didn't really see a whole lot of evidence-based recommendations for what to do about it. So I just got really interested in this topic, and the thought occurred to me that all of the isms might actually have some features in common, and it might help promote an explanatory model if I sat down, which I did, and thought about what they have in common, and hopefully make a contribution to moving forward to addressing where does social harm come from, and how can we address this absolutely tragic thing that we see in the data year after year after year, but we really seem to struggle with what to do about it and how to be effective. So that's what I'm interested in today. And the title of this group cast is Where Does Social Harm Come From? So, just to introduce my thoughts on this topic, I wanted to start with a question. And, take a moment yourself to think about your answer to this question. Is life essentially a competition? On the one hand, we can say, well, resources are limited and you got to compete to eat, right? If you don't compete, you don't eat, because resources are limited. That's kind of a fact in most areas of life. It might not be true all the time, but I think it's true enough of the time that it's something that all life forms are faced with. If you think about trees growing in the forest, well, there's a limited amount of energy falling on those trees coming from the sun, and some of those trees or plants are going to end up being in shadow, and just aren't going to have access to the energy that comes in the light from the sun. So trees have to learn in quotes, have to adapt to grow tall and spread out their limbs and try and capture as much of the energy from the sun as they can in order to survive. And that's, you can think of that as a form of competition, because the trees that perhaps don't grow as tall or don't spread out their limbs as much don't get as much energy and may not thrive. So, in a world where resources are limited, I think it's fair to hypothesize, to guess, that you got to compete to eat. That seems like a fair assumption to me. But then I don't want to get stuck on that, right? Like, I don't want that to be the whole story. Lots of authors have written about life as a competition, and they've stuck with that. They've said, well, life is only a competition, and that's life's essential feature, is that it is essentially a competition. But I don't think it is only a competition, especially for mammals. We're mammals, and there are lots of mammals on the earth, and it's an incredibly successful form of life. Mammals have spread out all over this planet and have been incredibly successful, and one of the main features of life as a mammal is that we cooperate. We're very cooperative animals. And, mammals live together in groups, and they oftentimes care for their young for an extended period of time. And that requires a lot of cooperation. Now, other forms of life do that as well. Birds, for example, plenty of examples of amongst birds. But that I don't think that is any challenge to my perspective. If we see cooperation amongst birds as well as mammals, to me that just shows that cooperation is an important part of life, kind of as a complement to competition. But especially humans, humans have these big emotional brains and relatively weak bodies. We're not as strong as lions and tigers and chimpanzees and gorillas, and our teeth and our claws certainly aren't as sharp, and we don't have as much fur and natural protection from the environment. We really have to work together to survive. A lot of our energy goes into our brain power, and brain power really supports a lot of cooperation. And so I think as mammals, humans, not having a whole lot of other natural assets to help us, protect ourselves and hunt for food, we really have to cooperate. So I think I would suggest that cooperation is super important amongst mammals and birds and many forms of life, but even more so, it's kind of supercharged amongst humans. So no, I don't think life is only a competition, especially especially not for humans. There's a lot of cooperation going on. And this is interesting to me in the mental health field, because we in the mental health field have really focused on cooperation a lot. And I think it's because we are such a cooperative species. We are so focused on social cooperation that in the mental health field, we really do have to focus on relationships, because when our mental health goes astray or runs into problems, oftentimes it's relationships that are really at the core of that concern. And if you look at things like validation and the effects of validation and its opposite, invalidation, on someone's emotional state, on someone's emotional status, I think most people in the mental health world would agree these are really critical factors to keep track of. And I'm happy to make an entire video on validation and invalidation, what that all means. But just here for shorthand, it means acceptance and understanding. And so social validation and invalidation are social phenomena are super important for people's emotional state and therefore their mental health. I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention the effect of social media and the ascendancy of social media in my lifetime and over the course of my generation. And we've certainly seen lots and lots of examples of increases in isolation and social anxiety, loneliness, fear of missing out. All of these are factors in the monumental increase in depression and anxiety and suicidality that we see amongst young people. And so, again, I think it just points to the fact that the critical place that cooperation plays in the mental health of our species, and the degree to which young people are really, really suffering because they're having to deal with factors that increase or decrease cooperativity in a way that I really don't think my generation had to deal with when we were growing up. So let's go back to competition for a moment, and I don't necessarily mean to suggest that competition is evil and cooperation is good. Really, I just want to be able to describe these two broad domains, these two broad behavioral domains of the way we move through the world. And under the broad heading of competition, I want to also include things like hostility, or things that we might call hostility and aggression. Certainly in the animal world, we can identify plenty of instances where animals will act in an aggressive fashion as a way of defending their territory. Aggression can be used to defend one's territory and can be used as a form of competition for resources, because of course if a lion, for example, growls or roars at a potential competitor, that's a display of aggression, and that display might cause the potential competitor to run away, and therefore it defends the territory. But these kinds of behaviors, aggression and hostility and competition, can also result in anxiety, fear, and depression, not just in the person who's on the receiving end of the aggression, but also in the aggressor. And so I think it's important for us to understand the natural consequences of competition. Yes, it might help you defend your territory, but there also might be significant emotional consequences both for the aggressor and the person or the individual who is the recipient of the aggression. So I think this is why therapists and all of us in the mental health world oftentimes focus on reducing competition and increasing cooperation as part of the treatment. We're aware of the negative and deleterious effects, the negative effects on emotional health that competition comes with, and we really want to increase people's cooperation as part of the treatment. And there's plenty of evidence to support this. Many of the major therapies that have shown incredible efficacy against some of the most difficult to treat conditions put a huge amount of emphasis on cooperation and on teaching people the skills that they might not have to increase cooperation and to improve their mental health. So again, I just want to paint some broad brushstrokes here, broad pictures of what I mean when I'm talking about competition and what I mean by the word cooperation. Under the broad heading of competition, I'm including things like invalidation, which refers to kind of not accepting people, not understanding people, not even trying to understand people. That is under the broad heading of invalidation, which is a huge topic, which I'd love to make an entire video on, as well as its counterpart, validation. But so under competition, we have things like invalidation, hostility, aggression, disrespect, intolerance and non-acceptance, contempt, rejecting people, rejecting their basic humanity, rejecting their place in the social order. Also, I think when we rank and we vote, I'm going to have more to say about that later, but I think ranking and voting are forms of competition. When you go to the polls in an election and you're asked to rank, you're asked to actually, oftentimes you don't rank, you just choose whoever you're voting for, and the person with the most votes just wins. There's actually no ranking going on. It's just straight up voting. But there are other instances where elections are structured so that you actually can rank your choices in order of preference. But all of this is a form of competition. You're being asked to directly compare one person to another, and you're being asked to make judgments simply based on those comparisons, simply based on the available options. And that to me is a form of competition, and I'll have more to say about that later. If you have any concerns or objections to that, I'm going to try and expand on that later on. Cooperation, on the other hand, in, again, broad categories, cooperation, under the broad category of cooperation, I want to include things like validation, acceptance, social acceptance, showing respect. Really important also, showing tolerance. When we tolerate, we are better able to cooperate. When we reject or are intolerant, we of course are not able to cooperate. We are more in competition. So cooperation, I think, involves a lot of tolerance and curiosity. It involves observing and describing and making assessments, not judgments. And I just noticed that I spelled judgment in two different ways, and I'm having judgments about that. Um, and so we can absolutely chart kind of these broad categories, competition versus cooperation. And again, I think that when we vote and we judge, that's a very competitive enterprise. When we assess and observe and describe and get more curious and try and get more information, that's a very cooperative enterprise. And so I just want to make those broad categories clear as to how I'm thinking about this, because competition versus cooperation is basically the model I'm proposing that we use to think about social harm. What this requires us to do, that is what we need in order to do more cooperating versus competing, is something called executive function. Executive function is just a fancy word for that part of your brain that slows down and does all of those things that I listed under the heading of cooperation. Let me go back to those. Oh, looks like I can't. Okay. Well, if you remember, all of those things that I listed under cooperation included things like validation and observing and describing and showing curiosity and showing tolerance. Those all fall under the heading of what psychologists call executive function. And it's a particular part of your brain that is located up here in the front, in the part that's called the prefrontal cortex. And it's basically the part of your brain that I describe as the president of the brain or the CEO of the brain, the part of the brain that's in charge of being in charge. And it's different from the impulsive part of the brain. The impulsive part of the brain is associated with emotions and fast responses. And that part of the brain is super important. Like if a car's coming towards you on the street, you don't want to be standing there kind of dithering and debating and trying to calculate how fast the car is going and the probability that they might swerve at the last instant. Like if a car's coming towards you on the street, that's actually a time that you want to be impulsive and get out of the way. You want to act quickly. But the cooperative part of the brain requires, cooperative behaviors, as I've sketched them out here, requires a different part of the brain, and that's called the executive or the president of the brain, and it's a slower part of the brain. So it's not the part of the brain that is really going to help you out of a immediately dangerous situation like a car coming towards you, because it's too slow. You need that faster, more impulsive part of your brain to help you jump out of the way. But if your goal is not to do that, if your goal is to be more cooperative with people, especially people who you might not be used to cooperating with, people who you're not used to thinking about as being part of your group or your tribe or your community, then you're going to need this other part of the brain that acts in a more slow fashion and really can help you tolerate distress. Because working with people who are different than you, different than us, different than those who you're used to, that can be tough. That can be distressing. They might communicate in different ways. They might have different mannerisms. They might have different customs. They might speak a completely different language. In order to cooperate, you might actually have to learn a language that isn't your native language. And in my case, obviously, English is my native language. You can tell from how I'm talking, how I'm speaking, that it is my native language. And there are times that I need to speak in languages that aren't my native language. When I'm at work, I oftentimes have to speak Spanish and not English. When I'm traveling, I might be in a country where they speak French, and I always apologize for how horrible my French is. I might be in a country that speaks Portuguese, and I might have to stumble along. I've been to Portugal, and they spoke Portuguese to me, and I spoke Spanish to them, and we got along really well, and people were super nice, and I loved it there. But it probably required some distress tolerance on their part because I wasn't speaking Portuguese. I was speaking Spanish actually, but they told me every time I tried to speak Portuguese, they oftentimes said to me, "Do you speak Spanish?" And I said, "Yeah." They said, "Just speak Spanish. It's fine. Just speak Spanish. It's better than my attempts at Portuguese." So that's what it requires. It requires executive function, which is a slow response, and it requires us to tolerate distress. And I love this quote by Barack Obama. He was on a talk show. You can watch it on YouTube. I think he was being interviewed by a friend of his daughter's. And he was talking about, he was speaking about call out culture, basically, and cancel culture, and advocating for us to not do that so much. I think he was trying to support more cooperation than competition. And I think this is just my interpretation from what he said. You can watch the YouTube video and see if you agree with me. I think he was trying to express the idea that cancel culture, call out culture, whatever you want to call it, is really competitive and is about casting stones at people, but it doesn't get us that far. And that's his opinion, and I agree with him. So I like this quote by Barack Obama, and I would encourage you to all track down the YouTube video where it came from. I can post that in the comments and and see what you think of this idea in context, because he said a lot more than this. So, as I said before, the executive function is the president or the CEO. It's slow and careful. It acts decisively and on purpose. It's authoritative, not authoritarian. And I oftentimes think to myself, what would Michelle Obama do if I want to try and figure out what executive function might do in any particular situation? What would Michelle Obama do? And that gets me started down that path of thinking about executive function and getting in touch with my own executive function. You must practice this skill. We must all practice this skill. It is not supported by our current environment. We live in an environment that is very much oriented, in my opinion. This is my humble opinion, of course. Feel free to disagree with me. I'd love to have more of a conversation about this, but my opinion is that our current environment is not supporting executive function. We live in an environment that supports impulse buying, and it has for a long time. I mean, I think social media has just amplified this, but we've had impulse buying. Impulse buying was around long before the internet and social media and smartphones. We constantly get the message, I think, from advertisers and the news media and just really everywhere in our environment that if you're not on top, if you're not winning, if you're not buying the latest and the greatest, there's something wrong with you. And if you are feeling down, well, the solution to that is, what do they call it? Shopping therapy, retail therapy, right? And a lot of this learning happened without our being aware of it. It's the world we grew up in, and I'm just as subject to that as the next person, because we grow up in an environment that teaches these things without us being aware of that. And I call that implicit bias, and I have an entire presentation on that, which you're welcome to view on my channel and see what you think. So I want to give you an example of how this might show up in just an everyday example that I just made up, just to illustrate the difference between competition, voting, versus cooperation and executive function. So imagine a child comes home and they've had a horrible day at school and they've had an argument with their best friend, and they've got this idea that they never want to speak to this person ever again. And they come home and they say to their parent, their mother or their father, they're never speaking to this person ever again. Let's call this person Sam. I'm never going to talk to Sam ever again. And the parent, who probably has maybe heard this before and is kind of fed up with this kind of pattern and just doesn't think it's the right way to raise a child anyway, or the right way to grow up, says, oh, yes, you're going to talk to them. You're going to call her up right now and work this out. Running away from your problems is no good in this household. That's not the way we do things here. And so what's happening here? Well, I think this is a perfect example of competition. The child has come home and announced that they've found the solution. They've voted on the available alternatives, and this is the solution that they're voting on. And that's the end of the story for them. And then the parent kind of comes back with the same kind of approach. Like they're like, nope, this is not acceptable. Your solution is not the solution. My solution is the solution, and I've voted. And just because I've voted, I'm the parent. What I say goes. And this is what I would call a very authoritarian approach. And I think it's competition. Competition is showing up. And the parent has responded to the child's voting with the voting of their own. And they're meeting competition with competition. And the problem I have with this, or the concern I have, let's talk about concerns, because that's kind of key to the solution here. My concern is that competition fosters competition. And I think to a certain extent, if I can interpret Barack Obama's statements, I think he was expressing a similar concern that meeting competition with competition doesn't get you very far. So the question is, for all of you perhaps to consider for just a moment, is what would you say or do if you wanted to change the overall tone of this conversation to be more cooperative? If you agree with me, and you don't have to, of course, I'm happy to have a conversation about this. I'm very curious what people's opinions are. But if you agree with me that in my example, the parent met voting with voting, competition with competition, what could the parent say or do if they wanted to shift the conversation from competition to cooperation? If this was a parent who believed or agreed with me that it is healthier to teach cooperation and it is healthier to encourage cooperation, what could they do to shift the tone? So here are just a few suggestions. You might have come up with some on your own, and maybe you want to go back and a couple of seconds and pause the video and maybe just jot down a few of your own ideas before you read these. But here are some suggestions, and hopefully it helps you get the flavor for this. This is not necessarily what everybody should do in all situations, but merely as an illustration. One thing that I might say in this situation is, oh crap, I'm so sorry. It sounds like you had a horrible day. What happened? What on earth happened? I can tell you're so upset. What happened? Or maybe I've heard this before and I can guess that it was Sam who they had the argument with, and I say, oh my God, did you have an argument with Sam? Like, you've had these before, right? Has it happened again? What's up? What are your concerns? It sounds like you're really concerned about your relationship with Sam. What's going on? What are your concerns? And I will oftentimes try and turn towards cooperativity. For me, the turn towards cooperativity is to turn away from solutions, right? The child has come home and they've announced a solution, but I want to turn towards cooperation. So I'm not just going to announce my solution because that's just more competition. I will try and turn the conversation away from solutions to concerns. And so I might say, what's up? What's your concern? Sounds like you're concerned about something. You're upset about something. What's up? On the other hand, another approach might be to just say to someone, do you need help or do you just need a hug? I mean, you might not be looking for any suggestions at this point in time. You're just so upset. You just want a hug. You just want to sit and talk with someone. You just want to vent. You want to have a cup of tea. You want to sit down and just have someone listen to how horrible your day was. Again, that might turn the conversation towards cooperation. Yes, let's cooperate on helping you cope with the fact that you just had a horrible day. I can do that. I can make us both a cup of tea. I can sit down. I can turn off my phone. I can give you my full attention. I can listen to everything that happened. And if you need a hug, I can give you a hug. But if you just need my attention, I can give you my attention. And we can turn towards cooperating on the project of helping you recover from this horrible day. If that's what you need, I can do it. And that's cooperative. That's how cooperation can come up. At least as those are some of the skills that are in my repertoire. Lots of people may have different ways of approaching it, but those are just some of the things that I do. Okay, so those are just some suggestions about cooperation, but now I don't want this to just be coming across as this like totally Pollyanna, pie in the sky, get together and sing songs and everything's going to be fine kind of approach to life, because that's not realistic, and I get that. And so I want to validate where some of the problems come from and what some of the problems might be that get us off track from cooperation and into competition and into some of that social harm that I was talking about. Remember, I wanted to address or try and come up with an explanatory model for social harm, including all of the isms: racism, ageism, sexism, classism, ethnocentrism, you name it. So here's where I think the problem comes up. If you cooperate too much, others really will take advantage of you. Like, that's a real thing. Sitting around and playing the guitar and singing songs together might be great under certain circumstances, but there might be other circumstances where it might actually be the wrong choice because people might actually take advantage of you. And that's a real thing. So I want to validate that. I want to understand that. I want to actually take account of that. If you cooperate too much, if you're always a doormat, if you're always kind of up for everything, if you're too permissive, too cooperative, people really will take advantage of you. That's a real thing in the world. The other side of the problem is that if you don't cooperate enough, it's pretty clear that you won't thrive as a member of a social species. Competition might work really well for alligators, for example, crocodiles. I'm imagining reptiles, lots of species of reptiles, which perhaps aren't as cooperative. I mean, what do I know? I'm just kind of hypothesizing. I'm not an expert in reptile behavior, but at first glance, they don't seem as cooperative on the whole as mammals. That's just my impression. And if there are experts out there in reptile behavior, please let me know if I'm wrong here. But if it's not reptiles, maybe it's some other group of animals or not even animals at all. But the point is that humans are super cooperative. That much we know. And if you don't cooperate as a human, you have a couple of choices. I mean, you might have to learn to live on your own in the wilderness, far from all other humans, just with no contact with humans. And maybe there are people that do that and make that work for them. Okay, fine. No judgment from me. But I don't think it works for the vast majority of humans. That's just my prejudice, that's my bias, that's my hypothesis. So we have this problem. That if you cooperate too much, if you're too much of a doormat, as they say, people will take advantage of you. But if you don't cooperate enough, as a human, as an average human, let's just say as a statistically common human, you probably won't thrive as a member of a social species. And here's another problem. I think that, and sorry, there's a typo here. We live in a world which is amplifying competition, not cooperation, competition, with a ferocity never seen before, never witnessed in human history. And by that I mean the internet and social media. The internet and social media, I believe, are amplifying competition. Apologies for the typo here. Competition, it's just astounding how much competition is being amplified on those platforms. And we can see it in the data. We can see that this is harmful. We can see that people are suffering the effects of unrestrained competition on the internet and on social media, smartphones, wherever it's happening. There was a study released in 2020, and I can put the link in the comments if people are interested. Study done in 2020 showing that between 2009 and 2018, the annual prevalence of suicide-related diagnoses in young people age 1 to 34 years old increased 3 to 4 times. 3 to 4 times increase in suicide-related diagnoses in 10 years. Sorry, 9 years. Probably, I would guess, I mean, I don't think it's just coincidence that I believe the smartphone was released in 2010. And so my hypothesis is that social media and the internet, the use and the overuse, and there are data on this, has been associated with increases in many forms of mental illness and emotional suffering, especially amongst young people. And I just have this sense that it is just amplifying competition at a just ferocious and exponential rate. So how does this happen? What's the explanatory model? And that's where I want to go with this. I want to try and propose some sort of explanatory model for all of the social harms, all of the isms that we talked about. Let's talk about the concept of voting. And by voting, I don't just mean voting in an election, like a presidential election. I mean any choice which is made rapidly and mainly in reference to other immediately available options. This could include actual voting. You go into the voting booth, or you vote by mail, or I don't know if it's done on computer these days in some districts. And you've got a list of names, and you just pick one. Or maybe you're voting in an election where they allow you to rank your preferences. But the point is you're comparing candidate A to B to C to D to E. You've got a range of immediately available options. Those are the only options. Yeah, you could write in something, but just for the purposes of this conversation, I'm not going to take into account the write-ins. Most of the time, you just got a list of names and you got to pick from those available options. And I think it's similar on the internet, right? Or on social media. You've got a range of available photos or people in your friend circle, and you vote. You vote on what you like and what you don't like. Or you walk into a store and you've got a range of options of hair care products, or well, that's not so much for me anymore. Not so much hair to buy hair care products for, but for people who have hair or any product they're interested in, you just got a range of options, and you pick the one. I would imagine most people pick the one that just attracts their attention, and so they vote. I think calling people out is also like voting. I mean, it's voting down, right? It's voting with a thumbs down instead of a thumbs up. But I think to me, I'm grouping all of these under a similar process, which is where what I'm describing is that you're making a rapid choice and you're mainly just comparing the options that have been presented to you. So it's important to understand that you're not aware of other options that might be out there in the world that aren't being presented to you. You're not aware of those because they're not in your immediate environment. You're just coming into this environment that has been structured by someone to present a limited range of options, and you're quickly choosing just by comparing the available options. That's what I want to kind of gather under this broad category of voting. And I want to contrast it with evaluation. So voting involves ranking your choice in comparison to the immediately available options. And it's quick, it's impulsive, it's emotional. It doesn't require a lot of energy. It's energetically cheap. It doesn't require a lot of effort. And it's very competitive, right? Because the available options are all competing for your attention. You know, maybe you're coming up to the cashier in the grocery store and you've got like, 5 of those tabloid magazines, or not even tabloid magazines. They might just be 5 magazines that you think are actually pretty high quality, but you pick the one that just kind of grabs your attention in the moment. So it's very competitive and it's very impulsive. And this is where, impulse retail, impulse buying, I think, came from long before the internet came along. It was a thing. And so I want to contrast voting to evaluation. What do I mean by evaluation? Well, I mean a process that takes more effort, is energetically more expensive, takes more time and effort, and might involve difficult questions like how likely is each option to benefit all of us in the long run? And this is a very different way of approaching an election, right? If you were imagine a different way of setting up the voting process. Imagine you walk into a voting booth on election day and they don't allow you to just pick one candidate or even to just rank them in order of preference. They want you to actually write down a percent assessment of how good you think this candidate will be for the country, 0 to 100%. So they're not asking you to vote in the traditional way. They're asking you to do an evaluation, to do an assessment. I don't think that would really work very well because I think people would be standing in those voting booths for a lot longer. Like we'd have lines out the door because people would be like debating like, well, this candidate, yeah, I think they might be 70%, but then they said that thing the other day, maybe I should drop that to 50%. But wait, there's this other candidate, they only seem like 30%, but they said something pretty cool the other day. Maybe they're a 40%. And I could just see people kind of getting into these loops. Like it could just take forever for them to actually make an assessment or an evaluation of their, let's say they're being asked to rate their confidence in how good this particular candidate would be for the country, rather than just choosing a rank order. They might even well, you probably can't carry your cell phone into the voting booth, so you're probably not allowed to use them. But maybe in a different situation, you might actually want to call a friend, like on the TV shows, like call a friend and get some input from them and have a discussion about it. All of a sudden, the process is much more cooperative. Evaluation takes a lot more effort. It's a lot more expensive in terms of the amount of energy you expend, and it addresses more difficult questions. And I think for that reason, oftentimes it just becomes more cooperative because you need help. You might have to look up data. You might have to do research. You might have to talk to your friends. And I think this brings us to the question of education. Where's education in all of this? What role does education play in our competitive world, and how much do we value education in a basically competitive world? Because I think from my perspective, education tends to encourage cooperation. Education is about cooperation. First of all, it's a slow function. It's one of those slow executive functions that requires time and energy. And it oftentimes, is energetically expensive and financially expensive. There's plenty of data now on the cost of education just skyrocketing through the roof. And this is just a tragedy as far as I'm concerned, because to me, education is just one of those social assets that is just worth its weight in gold. And we shouldn't be charging people so much for wanting to have an education. We should be begging them to get an education, from my perspective, because the benefits, the payoffs of having people pursue an education are just astronomical. But that's me on my soapbox a little bit there. We can certainly have a conversation about that. But clearly, education is expensive, and clearly it requires teamwork, and clearly it requires executive function. I don't think we can really, sure, anybody can disagree with me about anything, but I think those statements are less controversial, what education involves. So how do you choose? How do you choose between voting or evaluating, competing or cooperating? What's the best option? I can't say anyone knows for sure, because I have to be able to validate. I have to validate that competition pays off sometimes, especially when you're in a situation where if you cooperate too much, people will take advantage of you. And again, I don't want this to come across as just this kind of like pie in the sky, everything's fine, everyone's good, everyone's basically good, just believe in everyone's basic goodness, let's all just sing songs and play the guitar around the campfire together. No, I don't think that's realistic. I think sometimes competition pays off. And it's especially important to reserve that, what shall we call it, option in your toolkit for those situations where you're being taken advantage of, or just those situations where a car's coming towards you on the street and you want to outcompete that car for safety. In other words, you want to jump out of the way, and that's a form of competition. Fleeing from danger, I would say, is a form of competition. You're competing, in a sense, for safety, right? Like, I'm going to compete for the ability to jump onto the sidewalk out of the way of the car. Yeah, why am I going to do that? Because I don't want to get hit by the car. So I think it's important to understand that sometimes in the very real world, which is the world we live in, not this ideal world that perhaps you have experienced me rambling on about here, in the real world, competition can pay off. So how do you choose, compete or cooperate? Yes, competition can pay off. And I think it has hidden costs. I mean, it seems cheap in the short run, but I think it can really have deferred costs. First of all, it tends to decrease cooperation in the future because competition oftentimes involves aggression and displays of aggression, and it can induce stress and fear and anxiety, as well as loneliness and withdrawal. And for a social species, remember, we're talking about a fundamentally social species, humans, I think it probably makes the group less productive in the long run. That's my sense, that competition has some hidden costs. Yes, it may be important in the short run at times, especially if people are taking an advantage of you. I think it's very important to just oftentimes make a decision to walk away and devote your energies elsewhere. And that's a form of competition. Like that's a form of deciding, hey, I'm not going to waste my energy in this domain any longer. I'm going to move to a domain that's going to have better payoffs, and that's competition. But in the long run, I tend to bet on cooperation. That's my bias. That's my learning history. That's my prejudice. My personal belief that in the long run, cooperation, even if it costs a lot, I think that we are all better off cooperating rather than competing. I think it optimizes our use of resources, and in the long run, it costs less because I think it costs you less energy to be in a cooperative environment. You're less stressed out, you're less fearful, you're less anxious, you're less angry, and you're more able to devote your energies towards those cooperative behaviors that benefit everyone. So I think it actually costs less in the long run, and it involves education, which, as my father used to say, is the best investment. I mean, his point was they can't repossess your education. They can repossess your house, your car, your belongings, anything, any tangible asset that you've purchased. But once you have your education, it's there. And yeah, so I agree with my father. I think it's the best investment. And I want to wrap up with this quote by Michelle Obama, which to me indicates that I think the Obamas would tend to agree. That's my interpretation. That if we can reverse the competition into cooperation, I think we can reverse social harm. And so the explanatory model that I hope I have built up over the course of this group cast is that I think a lot of social harm is the result of unrestrained competition. Again, I don't mean to suggest that the answer to all of our problems is that we sit around a campfire and sing songs and play the guitar, but that we pay more attention to the hidden costs of competition and we use competition more carefully, and we have more of a fundamental commitment in the aggregate, in the overall picture, to cooperation. Not that we necessarily cooperate blindly with everyone, not that we become doormats or open or available to anything and everything, but that we start paying attention and looking for opportunities to build cooperation. If there's someone out there who you find after a reasonable amount of effort, you've got to make that decision for yourself, just isn't going to cooperate and you're wasting your energy, by all means, walk away. Like, don't sit around a campfire with them if it's not paying off. Seriously, I have no problem with that. And I think that's smart. I think that's a smart move. To use competition on purpose with awareness to make a deliberate, authoritative, not authoritarian, authoritative and non-judgmental decision, hey, this isn't working for me. My cooperation in this environment isn't working. Therefore, I'm going to use a little bit of competition to walk away, and I'm going to look for an environment that's more cooperative. My belief is that if you do that, you will find an environment that has lower costs and better long-term payoffs in the end, just because we are a social species. And I think that, you know, what Michelle Obama here is trying to express is this idea that the more trust we build, the more friendships we seek out worldwide, the more we can reverse this image of the United States as this super competitive place that doesn't care about anything but competition. And I don't think that's true. And so I agree with her, and I agree with the broader perspective, the broader point, which is what I wanted to use that quote for, which is that finding ways to seek out cooperation in cooperative communities really is, I think, the antidote to much of the social harm that we see in our world today. So that's my take on it. I look forward to your comments. I would love to talk about this some more. Obviously, I have a lot of thoughts on it, and there's a ton of reading to be done. There's a ton of information out there. Lots of other people have thought about it, not the least of which, of course, the Obamas. Obviously, you can tell that I have a bias towards their opinion. They are indeed two of my contemporary heroes, and but that doesn't mean that they know everything. So I would love to hear your comments and perspectives, and I hope that by having discussions, we can do more cooperation, all of us. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep on learning.